This is probably the most brutally long movie with an intermission that treats it like it's a Broadway play. The Brutalist. It's directed by Brady Cobert, stars Adrian Brody, Felicity Jones, and Guy Pearce. I'm going to be frank, I think it's a completely mismarketed movie, because if you're going to call it an American triumph, let's not paint the Americans as the villains here. I firmly believe that this movie in the future is going to be looked back at pretty negatively because of how immigrants are treated in this movie. Especially, I think it's a pretty timely topic right now in politics. And this movie is definitely very political, especially being post-World War II and talking about how certain Americans handle immigrants and whatnot. A lot of people are giving this movie 5 stars, calling it the greatest movie that came out last year or the greatest movie that's coming out this year, depending on if you saw it at a film festival or if you saw it like me at a wide release, because I'm just normal. I'm not going to do those film festival things yet. I'm going to start off with the positives because I think it's great to always lead into something. Before I get into the really sensitive subject matter, I'm going to give a trigger warning in this movie because I'm going to be talking about some very graphic things in this. This is not a spoiler-free review, so if you haven't seen The Brutalist, I do really recommend you go into this blind. I think that's the best way to do it because I am gonna sour the taste of this movie a little bit. So this is an art house film. It's definitely obviously an art house film. First of all, the music is really off key and it sounds beautiful at the same time. And then there's a lot of stationary shots that go by like all so quickly. And also it takes a little bit to get used to the accents. The acting is amazing, but the accents are sometimes so difficult to understand. But I guess that's the nature of trying to watch a movie that makes it feel like it's older when it really just came out last year. Although my theater experience in this, because I actually did just watch this last night, was really pleasant. I actually love the intermission that it brought on because for some reason it gave me anticipation. I was like, oh my gosh, there's like an act 2. I'm ready. Like, it seems exciting. And it kind of refreshed my idea of the possibilities of cinema, which is really exciting. This movie is an epic. First of all, it's R-rated, which I think is required for an epic. But then 2, it's 3 hours and 34 minutes. The first act really does feel like a 3-hour movie, which is fine. But then the second act goes really fast and it feels like 30 minutes. This movie, it takes its time, which I love, but I also hate, but I really love at the same time. It's a really conflicting thing. I felt like I was battling through that while watching the movie. And the plot moves unbelievably slow. Like, unbelievably slow at the start. It's just like a lot of talking, and it just feels like a lot of talking. But I feel like if I were to rewatch this movie, by the way, I'm not. But if I were going to rewatch this movie, it would make a lot more sense because certain characters appear that become very important in Act 2 or even later in Act 1, make their early entrances and the plot does move. But the plot starts moving very subtly, which is a really nice touch because it kind of catches you off guard. The cinematography of this movie is probably hands down some of the best I have ever seen. There were a couple like weird shots, but I feel like that's maybe more so just my artistic choice and my artistic appeal that would attract me as a viewer. But I mean, overall, the film felt completely consistent, and you don't typically see movies like this. What really pisses me off is that we consider Americans in this movie in particular as monumental. It's a monumental American movie when the Americans abused the immigrant and, yes, raped the immigrant that was building brutalist architecture. There's exactly a 3-minute rape scene in this movie, which, you know, okay, it happened for a reason. It showed the power struggle. Okay, we all understood that. But the way it ended is so disgusting. Okay, imagine a crime happened to you. Let's imagine somebody stole something from you and you just never got it back. That's what this movie does with the whole rape scene entirely. And it's quite frankly really distasteful and really insensitive towards, I think, rape victims in general. And actually, by the way, this movie leads up to no point at all with it. There's no build up, there's no tension, there's not even an argument that happens to like lead to this point. It just happens because he's an immigrant and he doesn't understand things. That's really what this movie paints it as. So I don't understand how people can claim this is a monumental movie when this is just nothing more than people being abusive and manipulative and controlling And then when the ending happens, let's talk about the ending, actually, to elaborate this even further. So the ending is actually not when they complete the church, which you'd think that would be the ending because it's about the journey of how this like multi-million-dollar structure made of concrete and the reasoning and the art style behind it. No, the movie ends with all of his architecture feat, and he's like this old crippled man now. And it's like right after we find out about like, oh, who raped the immigrant guy, Laszlo Tao. Like right after. And it just leaves you like, okay, so we just saw that whole 3-minute scene of violence, and then now we just have to imagine him as an accomplished architecture. To what point is trauma art, and then trauma is just trauma? Because I felt kind of traumatized in this movie, and I don't know why people are praising this movie. I will say at least 20% of this movie is a pornography film. Look, I don't mind all these like really intimate scenes because it shows a relationship between essentially two people, if not more, depending on what type of movie you're watching. But those scenes have no purpose. No purpose at all. There was no tension between Laszlo and his wife. The only tension was the architecture when two people died trying to build it, and then the rich American oligarchy family was like, oh my gosh, we don't want to do it because this is going to give us bad press. Okay, that's a fair reason. And so the only time they fight is during that exact moment because Laszlo was going to throw in the towel reasonably enough because he wouldn't have the funds to support it anymore. This movie has a lot of heroin use. Also, by the way, that plot goes absolutely nowhere, and then the heroin use also gets translated into intimate scenes, and it glorifies drug use in such a way that makes it look pleasurable rather than something you should avoid. Yes, Laszlo in the end scene accomplished absolutely everything. He achieved his dream, but you cut straight to that after everything like that happens. There's no complete ending with it. I'm fine with really sensitive and really hard discussions, but you have to finish the story. Like, you have to finish it, especially a complete circle of it. Let me give a really insensitive example. So imagine a 9/11 movie came out. And yes, this is an American movie. And we're building up to what caused 9/11 to even start happening. So let's say that the movie started a week beforehand, before the event. And so we're getting all this character development. We're learning about like the American government, the key players, but then we're also learning like the terrorists that are going to cause the national tragedy. And then it all builds up, and then part 2 starts to go, and then the planes hit the Twin Towers, and the movie cuts the credits. The movie cuts the credits after hitting the Twin Towers. There's no hope for the American people because the planes hit the 2 towers. That's the vibe of this movie. And it makes me so mad that people are calling this monumental. It's a movie that is mismarketed for what it is. Because when I saw the trailers for this, I wasn't initially interested. Coming into this movie, I thought it would be an American triumph. That's the way that this movie was leading itself. I mean, considering it's about a guy that changed the entire American infrastructure and architect, you think you should put respect on this guy's name. Let's go back to some of the positives. I think the soundtrack is really good. You don't typically hear a lot of brass in soundtracks, like really heavy emphasis on brass. The movie really hits the nail on that. Also, the movie, I think, has a really good flow. Yeah, it's painfully slow at the start, but then it really starts picking up towards the middle of Act 1. A lot of the character scenes, like when tension does start to build, it does feel natural. I don't think the actions, like the really serious plot points that happen, really translate well. I think all of the actors did a phenomenal job. I really think that they do deserve awards for their performances. Weird side note, I know since the movie split up into 2 parts, it really does feel like 2 different movies. The first one really feels like you're building a church. You are building a community for people. It's super challenging, and there's tension happening because it's like, how are we going to build this? How are we going to get the money? But it's nothing like antagonistic, like, oh my gosh, I hate you. It's like, how are you even going to do this type of conflict? Then the second act is like, oh, you have no money? You're useless. I'm gonna fire you. And it just like there's a weird tonal shift that happens. The more I think about this movie, the more I hate it. I'm gonna keep this at 3 stars, but this is probably one of the most disappointing movies for me for January, let alone for this year, because I had high expectations for this movie, considering one, it was A24, two, and one, a bunch of Golden Globes. And three, it just everyone was saying like 5 stars, 5 stars, 5 stars. I just don't think it's gonna age well, and that's just my opinion on it. I would love to hear your opinion. I want to hear different opinions on this and different takes. I'm not complaining about the length. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the pacing. I enjoyed the soundtrack. I love the characters in it, the writing in it. The only thing I really didn't appreciate was how abrasive the plot suddenly became. Loved the first half, hated the second half. Would never rewatch it again so I don't have to traumatize myself. Hollywood, can we just knock it off with the intimate scenes? They're annoying. It's kind of trashy. It didn't work for this movie. You know, I feel like 50 Shades of Grey would have like more plot than this. This one was just not it. I mean, they were super artistic. They were super stylized. It actually didn't feel invasive, but also it was like you like look back on those scenes and it's like, okay, what's the point? Oh, the relationship growing? No, it led nowhere. And for the last time, if we're going to call a movie monumental, put respect on the people that made a story monumental. Don't disrespect them like this. I'm not speaking for the Americans that did the bad stuff. Just put respect on the main character, at least, is all I'm saying.